Yo, what's up guys? Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing my second ever tier list on the channel, and I'm excited for this one. This is something that I've wanted to talk about on the channel for a while, which is basically the state of the current historic ban list, which is quite an interesting topic because Wizards' philosophy in historic going forward seems to be that if there is a problematic card that's too powerful, they're going to be nerfing it. They're going to be doing a digital rebalance rather than putting anything on the ban list. So it seems like the historic ban list is never going to grow beyond what we've got here if that's their philosophy going forwards. And I think within this ban list, there are some confusing things to do with their philosophy, whether they want free spells, whether they want fast mana or not, which will be interesting to discuss as we go through the cards. But there's also a lot of cards on the ban list that were banned in bygone eras, years ago now, when Historic was in a completely different state. So it'll be interesting to go through these cards and basically evaluate whether we think they're safe to unban or not. And I've basically come up with 5 categories to rank them in. First of all, why is this banned? And this will basically just be like the cards that were banned years ago and the format has completely changed and they would, basically almost guaranteed to be completely safe. Then we've got the next category, which is basically probably safe. So, cards that I do think would be safe to unban, but there will be some caveats to it as well, some potential issues. Then slightly on the other side, cards that I would want to remain banned, but it's close, right? I could see an argument for it being unbanned. The next time we got keep banned, which is pretty self-explanatory, and then right at the bottom we've got no chance. This is just the stuff where there's basically no debate. I think everyone would agree for them to stay banned. So yeah, really excited to get through this. And also I want to say I completely hear you on the feedback for the last video about putting the full card up so you guys can see what the card is rather than just trying to guess from the card art. So obviously going to be editing in the full card so you can see what I'm talking about. So let's just get straight into it. And we're starting off with a very interesting topic. I've decided to group these all together, but it's basically the land hate card effects. And this is quite pertinent at the moment because obviously a lot of people, including myself, think that Eldrazi Temple is a really big issue in Historic right now. Wizards have said they don't really want fast mana in the format. And a lot of people have been saying, between Eldrazi Temple and Ugin's Labyrinth and Lotus Field obviously being a very powerful card in one of the top combo decks right now, that a good counterplay to that would be these sort of land hate style effects. And with these hardlock ones, not including Spreading Seas that I'll talk about a little bit later, but these hardlock ones like Blood Moon, Magus of the Moon, Winter Moon, and Harbinger of the Seas, I just don't think you can unban these without a high density of fetch lands. Because I think the most important thing to do is just look at all of the, just any of the 2 and 3 color historic decks right now. Even a lot of the monocolored decks are running a lot of utility lands. So if basically I feel like since we only have Prismatic Vista as the only good fetch land in the format, if you unban these, it would just be a nightmare to play around, right? I think even if every 2 or 3 color deck ran 4 Prismatic Vista and 4 basics to go alongside it, that's only 8 lands out of your, 22, 24 lands, however many lands you're running. And there will be so many non-games where you just don't happen to draw your 4 of Prismatic Vista or your 4 basics, and you just lose to a Blood Moon and there's no counterplay. I think without a high density of fetch lands, these sorts of cards are just so difficult to play around. So for me, maybe we can have a debate about fetch lands, which we might as well because I've got it next up and it's also part of the same conversation. But I think a big part of Historic's identity is just not having fetch lands, and I quite like that, right? We've already got Timeless, which is a fetch land format on Arena, and I just generally think that it would put Historic and Timeless too close together, and it would change the format quite a lot. So what I would personally prefer going forwards is, rather than unbanning these just to temporarily deal with Eldrazi Temple, keep these banned, keep fetch lands banned, and just ensure that they ban or hit Eldrazi Temple and ensure that no other fast mana enters the format on lands, if that makes sense. So for me, I think Blood Moon, I'm going to put it in no chance personally because I don't want fetch lands added to the format. And like I said, without more fetch lands, these are literally impossible to play around. It basically just punishes you for running anything other than a monocolored deck, which really isn't good for the format. Now, with Magus of the Moon and Harbinger of the Seas, there is somewhat of a debate whether they should be slightly, less high on this list because there is more counterplay to them in the form of Dismember. Right, I think Dismember isn't a bad option for removal, and if they did theoretically unban Magus of the Moon and Harbinger of the Seas, I could see, decks moving from Fatal Push to Dismember to give you outs to these, but you shouldn't really be forced into a certain type of removal just to deal with these sorts of effects. So I'm tempted to put these into no chance for me. And then Winter Moon, I do think there's maybe a little bit more of a discussion because it's not as hard a lock as these, right? You do get to untap 1 non-basic each turn, which means that if you're running a very low to the ground deck, it's not really going to hurt you as much. And even if you do need to cast 2-drops and you didn't get lucky and find your basic land, you could just wait a couple of turns to untap them. Not to mention, it's obviously restrictive for the deck playing it as well. You do have to build your deck very heavily to not get hurt by your own Wintermoon as well. So out of these, I'm going to put Wintermoon in keep banned rather than no chance. But again, I know a lot of people have been clamoring for these, but honestly, if you try playing these in a format without a lot of fetch lands, there's going to be so many non-games, and I would rather play against Eldrazi Temple than Blood Moon without fetch lands, if that makes sense. And that's saying something, because I'm not a big fan of Eldrazi Temple in Historic right now. Then next up, we've got Wilderness Reclamation, which is quite an interesting one, because this is definitely a banning of a bygone era, right? This was banned years and years ago. Now, the difficult thing with Wilderness Reclamation, you might say, okay, well, it's a 4-mana enchantment. The format has sped up so much since Wilderness Reclamation was legal, but you've also got to think that Reclamation decks have also got a lot more tools. You might think, okay, 4 mana is quite slow, but we've got Exploration, we've got Burgeoning that allow us to, Exploration for a start allows us to cast Wilderness Reclamation on turn 2 and then immediately untap. And then obviously we've got a bunch more good instant cards that allow us to draw Memory Deluge, Consult the Star Charts, Preordain. There's really good instant speed interaction that we can now run with Reclamation. So I do think there's some caveats to it, but I think it would still probably be safe. And I think it would be an interesting part of the format if it was a good deck as well. I don't think it would be as oppressive as it was before. I think we have good enough tools to be able to deal with this if Reclamation did become a deck in the format. And honestly, looking at formats like Modern, which isn't always a good idea because they have a completely different card pool and ban list to us, but looking at formats like Modern is not really an issue. So I think Reclamation would probably be safe. And actually, I think it would be quite interesting as well, personally. Then next up, we got Veil of Summer, which I'm a big fan of this staying banned, personally. I don't think it's in no chance, because I think you maybe could make an argument that, especially as the format gets more powerful and the combo decks and stuff get faster, you do want to have some counterplay to, discard heavy decks, for example. But I don't know, I feel like Veil of Summer, it's just too efficient at what it's doing. If it didn't draw you a card, then I'd be more interested in it. Although, to be fair, if it didn't draw a card, then it probably wouldn't be playable. But, yeah, I don't know, this just feels like the biggest issue with Veil of Summer for me is that it can be used defensively and proactively, which is a big problem. I feel like it's just too good at both of those things, really. So, for me personally, I want to keep it banned, but if the format does become incredibly fast and incredibly consistent and discard spells are very common on turn 1 to then clear the way for a combo, then maybe you could make an argument for it. But I think Historic has been improved a lot since Veil of Summer got banned. And having played Timeless, where I think it is a strong card, I do think it would be a power level outlier in Historic personally. But I don't think it's down no chance. I do think you could maybe make an argument for it. Then next up, we've got Uro, which is another interesting one because, it's difficult to say because I think right now, slower, grindier, interactive decks have never really been worse positioned. Again, partially because of Eldrazi just pushing out the fair decks and a lot of fast aggro and combo decks being around as well. But I still don't know if it's a good card to have in the format long term. I think, as mid-range decks get more tools, this does just snowball the game a lot. The acceleration, the life gain, it basically would push aggro decks out of the format and to some extent control as well. And I'm not really sure that's healthy for the format. So I think with these sorts of cards where I'm unsure, I generally like to think, what are the risks? And the risks of this feel like they could potentially push, general archetypes like aggro out of the format if they did become good. So I'm going to put Uro in risky to unban, but I'd be interested to see what sort of impact it has, and especially what sort of decks it goes into as well. Then next up, we got Time Warp, and this one is the first one to go straight into the why is this banned category. So originally, this was banned because of the Velomachus Lorehold Transmogrify deck. I'm not sure if it was also running Creativity because it's a while ago now, but basically, the idea with that deck was you use Transmogrify or perhaps Creativity. I can't remember if the lists were running both. You cheat a Velomachus Lorehold into play, then you attack, and you run 4 Time Warps, so you could potentially take an extra turn, and then once Time Warp's in the graveyard, you can attack again and hit Mizzix's Mastery or another Time Warp, and basically just chain together a bunch of turns, and then obviously the deck would have other cards to hit as well outside of Time Warp, but that sort of deck wouldn't be good anymore. There have been multiple decks where I've wanted to play Time Warp. I think Eternal Witness Ephemerate decks, having Time Warp as a way to take infinite turns is a really nice way to do that. And I just think, in terms of power level, 5 mana take an extra turn, unless I'm completely missing any, a really broken synergy with this card, I don't really think it's going to have a big impact. I'm honestly not even sure it would be playable outside of fringe decks. So yeah, definitely going to put this straight into Wise's ban. I feel like this could be unbanned and potentially wouldn't see any play whatsoever. Then while we're on the topic, a very similar card, well, Temporal Manipulation is basically just the exact same as Time Warp, but with a different name. So again, I'm going to put this straight in. I think this was pre-banned because Time Warp was already on the ban list. So again, these will be fine, and there's no risk to having 2 of the same card, right? You wouldn't want to run 8 of these in a single deck anyway. So yeah, I think these will both be completely fine. And then next up, we got Fire Blast, which is kind of an interesting card to talk about because one of the key philosophies that Wizards has with Historic that they've repeated multiple times is they don't want free spells in the format, which I completely agree with. I think that's a really important differentiator between Historic and Timeless, and I do like that they've, got that as a philosophy. But I'm really confused because the last Powered Cube bonus sheet we got, they have allowed Snuff Out and Mind Collapse, both legal when they're both technically free spells, and I actually think that Snuff Out is a lot of times better than Fire Blast. Now, obviously, they're in completely different decks. The issue with Fire Blast, or I can understand the logic of doing that if you're worried about Fire Blast just pushing burn decks over the edge, which makes sense because Mind Collapse can only be used to take out creatures and planeswalkers, whereas Fire Blast going face is significantly better, especially for a free spell. But having said that, the requirements for Fire Blast aren't as harsh as Snuff Out. Snuff Out is easier to enable. Now, obviously, if you're running a burn deck, you are likely just going to be running mostly mountains anyway. So maybe that's not as big of a deal, but I don't know. I don't really see the massive power level disparity between Snuff Out and Fire Blast. Maybe I haven't played enough burn to recognize that, but I think for me, similar to how I would rather Eldrazi Temple get nerfed or banned and they keep the land hate cards, out of the format as well, I think I would prefer Snuff Out and Mind Collapse to remain banned, and we've just got a hard no free spells in the format rule for everything. I mean, I guess we've got Pact of Negation as well, which is a perfectly fine card to have legal, and that is also technically a free spell, but that comes with such a significant cost attached to it. So I'm a little confused about their philosophy on this as well. But in terms of Fire Blast itself, I think I can't put it any higher than risky to unban. Maybe I should put it in keep banned because, again, I've not played with or against the card, but I can completely understand how it would be broken, right? If you do just run a burn spell with a bunch of cheap burn cards and you're predominantly mountains, then it's not really too much of a risk to do that. So yeah, I think I'll put it in keep banned for now, but I wanted to bring up Snuff Out and Mind Collapse being confusing cards to have legal whilst they're keeping other cards like this out of the format, if that makes sense. Then speaking of free spells, we've got Subtlety as the first Evoke Elemental to appear here. And again, I'm going to rate these separately because they do all have different power levels. But again, I think, we want to keep these free spells banned. And I don't really think there's much of a benefit to putting individual ones in. I think while we're on the topic, Endurance, which is kind of the weird art we've got over here, is the one where I'm maybe thinking that it would be okay out of all of them because, we've already got Surgical Extraction, which is basically instant speed, free spell, graveyard hate. So putting Endurance in the format wouldn't really be too much of a downside. Now, I think the big upside of Endurance over something like Surgical is that you get a body and a hard castable threat on the battlefield as well, which is obviously less narrow, right? You can more easily main deck Endurance. You can also find it consistently with tutor cards like Chord of Calling and stuff. So maybe that's the big difference and that's the big reason. But spoiler, I'm not going to have any of the Evoke Elementals because I personally do agree with keeping free spells out of the format. Then next up, we got Tybalt's Trickery, which, I mean, on power level, this should be fine in the format because the Trickery decks, I mean, originally it was you would run, a bunch of 0 mana artifacts and Tybalt's Trickery, and then you'd counter your own artifact and just pray that whatever you hit off the Trickery wasn't another 0 mana artifact, and instead it was like, an Ultimatum or a big Eldrazi or whatever. And then when Throes of Chaos got added to the format, you would just run that, and then you cast Throes as early as possible, and it would cascade into Tybalt's Trickery because it would be the only cheaper card that you'd run in the deck, and then you would get your top-end card. And And I don't think either of those builds, I don't really think there'd be a new way to run Tybalt's Trickery, so I don't think it should be banned on a win rate. But in terms of gameplay, this card is absolutely horrendous to play against. It's basically, if the opponent pulls this off, it's a coin flip whether you win or lose, and there's no counterplay to it really, assuming you run game-ending threats at the top of your curve. So power level, this could be unbanned, but in terms of gameplay, we want to keep this one banned. I can't put it in no chance because there is a debate about it, but I'm going to put it here. And by the way, I'm going to be rearranging all of the categories once I've gone through the entire list. So hopefully we'll end up with like a more of a rankings towards the end. But yeah, personally, Tybalt's Trickery, keep it banned. Not good for gameplay, probably fine for win rate. But we if you're going to unban something, especially that's been on the historic ban list for such a long time, I think it needs to be a net positive for the gameplay and just the format as a whole, and Trickery just doesn't do that. Strip Mine, I mean, no chance, surely. I don't think there's really much debate to be had about this. It's already one of the best cards in Timeless, and it would be absolutely insane in Historic as well, so no chance there. Thassa's Oracle is an interesting one, because this is a card I have wanted to run in multiple decks, but thinking back at Historic over the years, in terms of decks that were so far ahead of the rest of the field at their time, the Tainted Pack deck felt like one of those decks that was just so far ahead of its time. Like when I first heard about the idea of, oh, you just run a deck that's all singletons, including the mana base, I kind of scoffed at it. I didn't think it would be very good. And then when people actually started picking it up and building optimized versions of the deck, I soon realized it is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And then obviously, as we get more cards added to the format, the downside of running one-ofs, especially as we get more lands added, becomes significantly lower. And the difference in mana cost, first of all, between Thassa's Oracle and Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, which is the way we have to win at the moment, is absolutely huge. Not to mention, this is much, much easier to win with Tainted Packs, because you just need the cast trigger to resolve, right? You don't need the Jace. For example, it's much more easy to interrupt the Jace Tainted Packs combo. So for me, I'm going to keep this one banned. I think it'd be too risky to put it in risky to unban, because I remember just how good those Tainted Pack decks were before. And like I said, we have so many better cards now that you'd be struggling to fill a 60-card singleton deck. You would actually have meaningful choices to be made. I don't think you would be running poor card quality, which you kind of used to have to do when the deck was originally around. So personally, from having played Tainted Pack with Thassa's Oracle, I want to keep this one banned. Not to mention, I think it also does make things too easy for other decks that are looking to mill your entire library consistently as well. So I think it's kind of nice to have this banned as a stopgap, because it's just so much better than alternatives that we have. We've got Laboratory Maniac legal now, which we basically never CC play, and Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. I just feel like Thassa's Oracle is so much better, and the decks it's running are usually very degenerate as well, if that makes sense. The next up we got Seething Song, which is quite an interesting card, because it is kind of fast mana, but it's also a 3 mana card, so I don't know if you'd consider it to be fast mana. But having said that, I do think there's a lot of really broken stuff that you can do with this card. I think it being legal in one of the only Eternal formats where Underworld Breach is still legal is a bit of a risk. I also look at some of the 5 mana cards that this could accelerate into, like Cavern Consumed, right? If you have this legal, you could run, even if you just stayed in mono red, you could still go Strike at Rich turn 1, Seething Song into Cavern and just win on turn 2, which seems a little bit too pushed for me. Not to mention, I'm sure there's a million other uses of it, like I said, in Storm decks with Underworld Breach and stuff. So while there is a debate to be had here, because I don't know if you could consider a 3 mana card fast mana per se, but I think it probably does too much degenerate stuff that it would be too risky to unban, in my opinion. The next up we got Reanimate, which I mean, I don't think many people would argue that Reanimate should be legal, but I'm not sure I'm going to put it straight in no chance, because we do have 2 mana alternatives which aren't that much better. Now, obviously, the difference between 1 and 2 mana is absolutely enormous, but with Persist and Life Death legal, I'm not going to put this in no chance. I'm going to put it in keep ban for now. But yeah, I mean, 1 mana Reanimation is just way too efficient for Historic, I think. Persist and Life Death do see play, even though they're not top tier. They are still doing very powerful stuff in Historic. So yeah, don't think anyone's really going to argue a good case for Reanimate being legal in Historic, but I don't think it's on the same level as a card like Strip Mine, personally. Then next up we got Preordain, which I think on its own would probably be fine, but when we've already got Ponder legal in the format, I think it would make decks that utilize cantrips, like your Lotus Field and, is it Wizards, is it Phoenix and whatever, I think those sort of decks would be way too efficient. So I'm going to put it in risky to unban, but if Ponder wasn't legal, then I would make a case for Preordain potentially. Then next up we got Spreading Seas, which maybe I should have talked about this with the Blood Moon style effects, because they are kind of similar. But this one, I just don't understand why it's banned, right? The reason I really dislike these is because they're mass land hate effects, right? So, not only does it hit your Eldrazi Temples and your Ugin's Labyrinths and stuff like that, but it hits every single non-basic. And without fetch lands, like I said, Historic is so reliant on non-basic lands for even certain monocolored decks to work, let alone 2+ color decks. So, my issue with these cards just doesn't apply to Spreading Seas. And, even in the current format, I don't think Spreading Seas would see that much play. Obviously, it would be nice to be able to hit Ugin's Labyrinths and Eldrazi Temples, but I don't know what blue deck would really get pushed by this. I just don't understand why this one was banned on the same level as these. Like I said, these, without fetch lands, I think would be a menace in the format and cause loads of non-games. Just hitting one land for 2 mana and, drawing a card and maybe enabling some Island Walk synergies just really doesn't seem that much of a problem to me at all. So this one for me, maybe let me know in the comments if, there's a reason why you think this would be a problem in current Historic, but this is one where I'm just kind of baffled why they pre-banned it in the first place, because it's really not on the same level as these sort of mass land hate card effects, if that makes sense. Then Solitude. Again, I'm not going to put it on the same level as Endurance because I think it has a much more powerful effect. But again, keep it banned. I could see a world where these were legal alongside fetch lands, but you're then basically just talking about Timeless. So keep these banned. I do think this would be more of a problem than than Subtlety. But yeah, I'm very happy to keep these sorts of free spells out of Historic. Sneak Attack is kind of an interesting one. I'm going to put it into risky to unban, but I have thought that it would be kind of an interesting card. Now, maybe I'm kind of uneducated on this because I've tried it in Timeless where it's just way too slow, and I've not really seen it in action in formats like Legacy, where I know it has been a big impact, or had a big impact in the past. But being a 4-mana card that you then need to pay a mana to activate doesn't seem too pushed for Historic. Now, again, Cavern Consumed is already seeing play in a decent deck in the format, so I think, having said that, yeah, okay, maybe I can see it, right? Cavern Consumed is already good, and that is basically Sneak Attack, but way less powerful, right? If you can chain this together, if you've got extra mana, one of the brews that I came up with in Timeless a long time ago is a Goblins build where, you can keep putting Matrons in play or Ringleaders and Muxuses in play and then keep sacrificing your creatures for red mana. So there's combo stuff that you can do outside of, cheating Emrakuls and whatnot into play. So yeah, I think I've kind of talked myself out of it, considering Cavern Consumed already sees play, and this is just a strictly better Cavern Consumed. But, I have thought that Sneak Attack is just nowhere near good enough for Timeless from my experience. So I was hoping maybe it could be okay in Historic, but yeah, and thinking about it a little bit more, I think, that one should be banned. Then next up, Lightning Bolt. Now, this is a contentious one. This is probably the one that I've seen the most universal support for to come off the ban list. And I agree to an extent, but I still want to put some caveats in here. I'm not going to put this in why is this banned. I'm going to put it in probably safe. And the main reason for this is I think the best argument for unbanning Lightning Bolt in Historic is just that, first of all, the interaction in Historic just isn't good enough compared to the threats we have. And especially that's the case in red. Now, obviously, that's more of a case in green, but that's kind of one of the staples of green as a colour. That just doesn't have that good interaction. Your interaction in green is usually fight style effects. But if you're looking at red interaction in Historic right now, there really isn't many good options, right? If we compare it to Chain Lightning, which is basically a sorcery speed Lightning Bolt, and sorcery speed is such a big downside. And then you've got Shoverside, which is kind of a half and half, where it's sometimes an instant and sometimes a sorcery, but it also can't go face. So I think I fully back the argument of we need better interaction. Red in particular needs better interaction, so just unban Lightning Bolt. But my issue there is that I'm not sure Lightning Bolt is that much better than options we've got at the moment, that it's worth risking aggressive decks getting too many tools. Now, again, I'm not saying that I wouldn't unban Lightning Bolt, but I do think there's a caveat that I would kind of prefer them to put an instant speed lightning bolt that can't go face, like an alchemy card, into the format maybe, to increase the quality of interaction we've got without incidentally pushing decks like Boros Energy. You know, if Swiftspear's Teachings, for example, didn't get nerfed, which I'm sure it will eventually get unnerfed once it rotates out of Alchemy, then decks like Is It Wizards become even more pushed with cards like Lightning Bolt. So my one caveat with this card, I'm not saying it shouldn't be unbanned. I definitely think it should be unbanned, but my concern is that it would incidentally improve the aggressive decks, and I can see a format where Boros Energy becomes the best deck, and then you suddenly give it Lightning Bolt on top of that, on top of, you know, Ajani Bombardment as good reach. So I do have my concerns, but I definitely still would be happy to unban Lightning Bolt. Show and Tell, no chance. I mean, you know, it's historically one of the best cards in Timeless, and it's just way too pushed for Historic, I think. I don't really think there's too much debate about Show and Tell, really. I'd be surprised. Let me know in the comments if you have a good defense of Show and Tell. But yeah, for me, just go straight into no chance. And now, before we go any further, I just realised I've used the wrong card art for the wrong card here. So for the people in my last tier list video who were saying, make sure you put the full card in so we actually know what you're talking about, I see you. I'm even confusing myself here sometimes. So this is actually Swords to Plowshares. This is the Firebolt art. So Fireblast art. So Fireblast goes straight into here. Swords to Plowshares, though, I mean, one of my biggest criticisms with Historic for a while now has been just we don't have good enough interaction to deal with the threats, which leads to most decks being very linear. But I don't think Swords to Plowshares is the answer to that, right? I think we can ask for better quality interaction in Historic without just, you know, making arguably the best white removal spell of all time legal. So whilst I would really like better interactive options in Historic, I think Swords to Plowshares is just too good. It's just so much better than every other removal spell in the format. It's so much better than every other white removal spell. It would probably force a lot of decks to want to splash into white. So yeah, I do want more interaction, but I don't think Swords is the right power level for Historic, personally. The next up we got Fury, so another Evoke Elemental, and again, this one for me is just going straight into Keep Banned. And honestly, out of the ones we've got on here, I think Fury is probably the most problematic. We've seen from Modern how it can be very restrictive to the viability of small creature decks, so I think it would actually be more format warping than Solitude and Subtlety, but I don't think it's on the same level as, you know, your Strip Mines and Show and Tells and stuff like that. Then next up we got Pyrokinesis, so another free spell. This one I understand a little bit more than Fireblast, but again, I think the big saving grace with this one, even though you don't need, you know, 2 mountains in play like you do with Fireblast, is that it can't go face. So, you know, there is a restriction there. It's also, because of that, a much more fair card. So I don't think I'm going to put it on the same level as Fireblast. I feel like Fireblast is more risky because, you know, it's doing more degenerate stuff. If you run this in a burn deck, then, you know, getting that last 4 damage to the face is really brutal, whereas this only hitting creatures is less of an issue. But again, I think it's still risky to unban. And like I've said a few times, I would really like Wizards to stick to the philosophy of no free spells, no fast mana in Historic, and, you know, unbanning a card like Pyrokinesis would kind of go against that, if that makes sense. Then next up we've got Frantic Search, which, I mean, even without Lotus Field being one of the best decks in the format, I could see an argument why you would not want to have this legal in the format. But whilst Lotus Field is a top tier deck, it just makes no sense to make this legal, right? Like I said, Lotus Field is already arguably the best combo deck in the format, or it definitely has a good claim to it. It's absolutely top 3, and Frantic Search would just be such a significant buff to that archetype, not only providing you card selection and digging through your deck, but also then untapping your Lotus Field and generating an absurd amount of mana if you have multiples, or if you've got a Deserted Temple as well. So yeah, absolutely keep this one banned. And I mean, I'm not going to put it in no chance because I don't think it's on the same level as, you know, your Strip Mines and Show and Tells and stuff. But whilst Lotus Field is what it is right now, I'm kind of tempted to put it down there. But yeah, for now, for me, just in the Keep Banned section. Then Ragavan, I mean, I'm not going to, you know, advocate for Ragavan being legal. So I think I'm going to put it in the Keep Banned section. I think, yeah, it's just too snowbally. It's too good on rate. Although having said that, I think, you know, we are getting to the point now with the threats in Historic where we're not too far off Ragavan being a manageable card in the format, but, you know, I think this is just would be a slam dunk in the Jund decks, you know, running this alongside Barrogoyf and Pyrogoyf and discard spells and interaction. I think it would be a little bit too much. And we don't have the same sort of tools that we did in other formats, right? Orcish Bowmasters is still nerfed, which was, a big downside of running Ragavan in Modern and made it more of a palatable card there. So I don't think we really have the tools right now, and I don't think even though the threats in Historic have gotten a lot better, I don't think we're quite at the point now where Ragavan would be a good addition to the format. And like I said, from Wizards' point of view, and just in general, it's a big risk to unban anything, so I think you would need to be confident that it would be a benefit for the format going forwards, and right now I really don't think Ragavan would be a benefit going forwards. So next up we got the first of the Flare cycle, and I've decided to group these all together, because they are all free spells, so I'm not going to advocate for any of them as safe unbans really, but they do all do quite different stuff, so I do think they could potentially go into different tiers. So Flare of Malice, for a start, I think is one of the better ones, and for that reason I think we've got to put it straight into the keep banned. I think, we've seen with Snuff Out that they don't mind putting free interaction in the format, which, again, I don't think Snuff Out is too pushed for Historic necessarily, although having said that, I haven't really faced it from the other side too much, so I've not actually experienced playing against it to have a really accurate opinion on it, but I think I'm happy with these sorts of cards not being legal. Although having said that, you could maybe make the argument that Flare of Malice is more difficult to enable than Snuff Out, which is kind of an interesting thought. So, I mean, maybe that's a reason to not have it as low on this tier list. But having said that, I think by that logic, I would just prefer Snuff Out to also be banned. I mean, I guess actually the full life is a pretty big downside, as is needing a swamp when we don't have fetch lands in the format. So maybe that's not true, actually. Maybe there are enough downsides in relation to Snuff Out. But again, if it was me and I was doing, reevaluating it, I would keep with the philosophy of no free spells, ban Snuff Out, ban Mind Collapse, and just have a blanket no free spells unless they have such a significant downside like a Pact of Negation, for example. The next time we got Flare of Solitude, which is basically a free protection spell. And again, I mean, I don't think I'm going to put this on the same level as Flare of Malice, for example, because I think for the most part, if this was legal, which I don't think it should be because it is a free spell, but if it was legal, it would likely just be a sideboard card in creature decks. And again, there it could be frustrating, right? If, a creature deck like Boros Energy was the top deck, for example, and them having access to free protection like this would be frustrating, but I don't think it would be as warping. I don't think you would see this card in the main deck, really. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in risky to unban rather than keep banned. But again, they're both free spells. I don't advocate for them being unbanned, really. Next up, then, we've got Flare of Duplication, and I think out of the entire cycle, this is the one that I would advocate for unbanning more than any of the others. Now, again, I think it's still very risky, and I do think if there is a good Flare of Duplication deck, then we're in trouble. But the way I see it at the moment, there isn't really a consistent way to win with this unless I'm missing something. There is maybe a chance that I am, for sure. But if not, I could see this kind of as a cool enabler for some fringe combo deck. But then I guess you got the issue of if that deck becomes more consistent, then you're running a free spell as one of the key cards in it. So again, don't advocate for being unbanned. But honestly, out of these, I think this is the one that I would want to see unbanned before any of the others, if that makes sense. Then we've got Flare of Denial. Free counter spells, again, I don't think we should be having free spells in Historic. I think that's one of the parts of the identity that I like the most. If you like free spells, you got Timeless, and Flare of Denial does see quite a lot of play in a number of decks there as well. So again, I think Flare of Denial is probably more of an issue than Flare of Malice, because killing a creature once it's already in play isn't as brutal as having something countered. So yeah, I think out of all of them, Flare of Denial is the one I would want banned the least. But I think it's on a similar level to Flare of Denial. And then Flare of Cultivation, again, I don't think it's as bad as Flare of Denial, but this card is just going to lead to some very, very explosive starts, right? I think one of the issues with this card in Modern is they only really have Arboreal Grazer in decks that need to get a high density of lands in play, whereas in Historic we have Arboreal Grazer and Kami of Bamboo Groves, which is arguably better than Grazer as well. So we've seen from the Titanfield decks of old in Timeless that this card with those enablers are very, very powerful and can enable some explosive starts. And we're already seeing in Historic with Simic Eldrazi being very good, and Valakut decks as well. You know, I think this card would be absolutely phenomenal in a deck like Valakut if you are running 4 Grazer, 4 Kami, and then you wouldn't necessarily need to be as reliant on cards like Exploration as well. But either way, I think, you know, we don't want free spells in the format, and this would lead to just way too much speed for those sorts of decks as well. Once Upon a Time, I mean, I'm tempted to put this one in No Chance. Again, it's another free spell, and this one just... It's big for consistency, but I think the power level is just way too high for this, right? You know, it feels like kind of a cheat code when I'm building decks in Timeless that can utilize this card, because it does just improve your consistency so much. So yeah, I mean, maybe it's probably not on the same level as Strip Mine and Show and Tell, if I'm being honest, but, you know, it's definitely not a card that I think should come back in Historic. And again, as we get more cards added to the format, it's just going to keep getting better and better and better as well. So yeah, definitely happy to put it in Keep Banned, and, you know, maybe there's an argument for putting it down here, but we'll see. Then Oko. I mean, I'm kind of tempted to put this one in No Chance, because I played against this in Historic when it was legal. I played against it in multiple formats when it is legal, and it is absolutely brutal. And I do think that, you know, it is legal in Timeless and sees very little play at the moment, but even towards the start of the format, where it was way more powerful than Historic is right now, it did see play early on. So I think in the context of Historic and where it is right now, I mean, I'm tempted to put it in No Chance. It's definitely between these two for me. I mean, I think I'm going to put it in Keep Banned, because I think the stuff in No Chance does feel like a step above everything else. Your Strip Mines, your Show and Tells are quite a bit more powerful than Oko, for example, but it's definitely borderline for sure, and I could see the argument for it being down here. The Nexus of Fate, okay, getting more stuff into the Why Is This Banned category. This is a card that I don't really understand why it got banned in the first place, unless if it got banned before Nexus of Fate, then that makes sense. In fact, I think that's what happened. I'm trying to remember back now because it was a really long time ago, but I think they banned Nexus of Fate first. I can't really remember, or maybe they banned them together, but either way, if Reclamation is banned, Nexus of Fate is no problem whatsoever. And now in, you know, Historic in 2026, these cards can coexist together. And the annoying thing with Nexus of Fate is there have been multiple decks over the years where I've wanted to have access to this as a one-of. In decks that are very good at churning through your deck, having a one-of Nexus of Fate gives you the inevitability to, if you can get the game to the point where you are down to your last few cards, you can just take infinite turns. And whilst infinite turns, you know, can be very powerful and can be game-breaking, if the way to set it up is draw through your whole deck and then need 7 mana to cast it every single turn, that doesn't seem like much of an issue at all to me. So yeah, I'm still baffled as to why Nexus of Fate is banned. You know, even if you had these two cards legal together, I don't think they would be viable in Historic. In fact, I think if Reclamation and Nexus of Fate got unbanned, you'd probably run one Nexus of Fate in the list, but I don't think you'd run any more than that in a Wilderness Reclamation deck. And I think a Reclamation deck will only be marginally worse without Nexus of Fate at all. So yeah, this one seems like a completely safe ban to me, and there have been multiple decks, like I said, where I've wanted it. Mystical Tutor is kind of an interesting one. Again, I feel like it's one of those cards like Swords to Plowshares, like Reanimate, where the effect itself isn't too broken, but the rate you're getting it, 1 mana for this sort of effect, is too good for consistency, I think. So I think this is another one I'm going to put in the Keep Banned category as well, just because same sort of reason as Reanimate, it's just too efficient compared to other options that we've got in Historic, really. Then next up we got Demonic Tutor, and again, same sort of rationale as with Mystical Tutor here. You know, we've got similar options like Assemble the Team that already see play at the moment, right? You know, fairly recently, with the green Sorin builds, they were running Assemble the Team. I've been running Assemble the Team and Brood-Scale combo and a few other combo decks as well. So having Demonic Tutor just be the same card but more consistent and less restrictive because you don't need to be in another colour, again, it's just too good on rate. And honestly, I think this one is so much better than existing options that I'm going to put it into No Chance. You know, I think it's more egregious on rate than Reanimate and Mystical Tutor compared to existing options that we've got. You know, especially because we don't restrict cards in Historic. So if this did theoretically get unbanned, it would be as a 4-of, which is, you know, in my opinion, more egregious than getting, you know, a Mystical Tutor or a Reanimate as a 4-of, personally. Necropotence, I mean, it's definitely either in one of these two for me. I'm just trying to debate whether it should go alongside the Demonic Shooter Show and Tell Strip Mine cards, or if we can have it in Keep Banned, because we do have Necro Dominance legal. Now, obviously, Necro Dominance, for the most part, is worse than Necropotence. Obviously, Necro Dominance does synergize well with Shieldred the Apocalypse, which opens up some synergies there, but yeah, I mean, I think I'm not going to put it in no chance because we do have a relatively similar card that's legal and doesn't really see much play. So I think I'm going to put it in Keep Banned. But yeah, if Necropotence was legal in Historic, it would absolutely see play. But I don't think it's quite on the same level as the other cards in No Chance. Natural Order is kind of an interesting one because ever since it was added to Arena, I've always been under the impression that it would be too powerful for Historic. But right now, I'm not sure. I mean, again, I think it is risky to unban for sure. I'm not advocating that Natural Order get unbanned, but I am kind of tempted to put it up here in that I do think it would be an interesting tool to have. It's nowhere near good enough for Timeless anymore, which shows the power level compared to some of these other banned cards. It isn't quite on that level. And I'm just trying to think of the decks that would run it, though. I mean, maybe if we do have, an Arboreal Grazer deck, I mean, Valakut's maybe a good example where you could go Arboreal Grazer or Kami on turn 1, and then on turn 3 you Natural Order for a Primeval Titan and get Valakut online incredibly quickly. So for that reason, I think we probably have it on Keep Banned rather than risky to unban, because it is very, very risky to unban. And obviously, outside of that, getting this down early, if you go Exploration, Colney Garden, then you can Natural Order for an Atraxa. So yeah, I think I got a little bit too gassed when I started thinking about this card. I think it is probably in Keep Banned, but I could see it being, more towards the safer end in this category. But yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see Natural Order legal. But yeah, thinking about, the current decks, thinking about Valakut right now, I think that would be a slam dunk home for it there. Obviously, it would see play in decks like Elves, and Natural Order alone would be a pretty significant buff to the viability of a deck like Elves, especially because Natural Order for Crater Hoof is such a powerful play. So yeah, was probably too lost in the sauce thinking to put it up here. But out of the keep banned category, I do think when I do get to rearranging these that it might be, kind of nearer the top than near the bottom. Then Mox Opal. Again, I think we should keep this one banned. I mean, we already have Affinity as a tier 2 deck in Historic, and I do think the thing that is holding Affinity back is the lack of speed. It does, unless you have those Pinnacle Emissary into turn 2 or 3 Kappa Cannoneer openings. One of the big weaknesses with the deck is it does take a little while to close the corner, which does make it weak against fast aggro decks like Auras. It does make it vulnerable somewhat to combo decks unless you can get Metallic Rebuke online very early. And Mox Opal feels like it would just immediately fix all of those issues and push a deck that has already been around the top tier way too high. And again, said it a few times, I'm very happy with the philosophy of no fast mana as long as they're consistent with it. And so I do think that Mox Opal wouldn't really be much of a benefit to the format. But again, I don't think it's on the same level as some of these cards. Then Mishra's Bauble, I mean, again, I think it would enable too much stuff like Dragon's Rage Channeler, like, from Modern, all the synergies that it has. We also have Lurrus legal. We're one of the only formats that still has Lurrus legal, and Bauble would be a huge buff to Lurrus. And obviously Lurrus has been a key card in the format for a really long time, but I think at the moment, at the very least, it's not oppressive, right? It is, obviously, Lurrus decks are some of the best decks in the format, but right now, Lurrus doesn't really feel like a problem, and I feel like if you put Bauble in the format, immediately Lurrus has a bullet, has a big mark against it. It's very likely to then get banned. So I would personally, in the current format, rather have Lurrus legal and Mishra's Bauble banned, not to mention all the other stuff that it can do in the format as well. It immediately buffs Affinity, it immediately buffs a lot of cards that trigger when you cast non-creature spells as well. So again, maybe you could make an argument for risky to unban. And actually, compared to some of these other cards, I think I am going to put Bauble in risky to unban. I don't think it should be unbanned, but I think it would be less of an issue than, the free spells or Oracle or Oko. So I'm actually pretty happy to put it in this category here. The next up, we've got Memory Lapse. And this is an interesting one because I don't want to see this card legal again in Historic, because in terms of power level, we've got Counterspell legal in the format, which you could argue is a more powerful Counterspell, and I think Counterspell generically is probably better than Memory Lapse. But the issue I have with Memory Lapse is it's such a polarizing card in that it's either absolutely brutal or it doesn't really do anything, right? If you're in the state of a game where the opponent has a potentially game-winning spell and you counter it with Memory Lapse, it just goes on top, opponent redraws it, and they cast it again the next turn. That's really bad for the Memory Lapse player. Not to mention, obviously in the context of Historic right now, with Eldrazi everywhere, conventional counterspells just aren't that good anyway. But I'm thinking of the long-term health of the format here, right? If Eldrazi does end up getting hit, or the format evolves to a point where Eldrazi isn't a problem anymore, then counterspells might come back. But my issue with Memory Lapse is kind of similar to it was with Tybalt's Trickery, in that in terms of power level, I think it's probably fine, right? Counterspell is legal, is likely the better card, and doesn't really see that much play at the moment. So I think in terms of power level, Memory Lapse would be fine to unban, but if you played against this card when it was legal, you know how brutal it can be, right? It was very often when this card was the counterspell of choice that if I had 2 lands and a 2-drop, but I didn't have my 3rd land, I would actively not play my 2-drop, because if it got hit by Memory Lapse, I just lose the game, right? My 2-drop goes on top of the deck. The rest of my hand is uncastable because I don't have any more lands. I'm missing my lands for the turn. So Memory Lapse, I mean, I don't think I'm going to put it on the same level as Tybalt's Trickery. I'm going to put it in risky to unban, because in terms of how miserable to play against it is, Tybalt's Trickery, the whole game is decided by it. Whereas Memory Lapse, again, it's not that good in certain situations, but when it is good, it's so brutal to be on the other end, and it doesn't really lead to great play patterns, in my opinion. So I'm going to put it into risky to unban, but on a personal note, this card is just kind of miserable to play against in a lot of situations. Mana Drain, I mean, this is absolutely no chance. I mean, like I said, we have had Counterspell in the format and it hasn't really seen too much play, but the difference between Counterspell and Mana Drain is absolutely bonkers. It was kind of crazy when this was made legal in Timeless in the first place. Now, again, Timeless Mana Drain doesn't really see that much play right now, but I think that's just mainly to do with the other decks in the format rather than the power level of Mana Drain. I could very well see if miles down the line Timeless evolves and counterspells become good again, then I'm sure Mana Drain will see play again. But in terms of the context of Historic, this is just way too powerful. And again, just no chance. I mean, I don't really think I need to explain about Mana Drain, really. I don't think anyone can really make a great argument for having this legal in Historic. Then Land Tax. Again, this one's really difficult because most of the other cards on this list I've played with or against in some form, whether that's Timeless or, I did used to play Magic Online, so I have played some older formats as well. Land Tax, though, is a card I have just never played against. And, I mean, it doesn't seem game-breaking at all, really, but it does seem very powerful at what it's doing. So I think... I'm not going to put it on the same level as these cards. I don't think it's on the same level as a Thassa's Oracle or Reanimate, but I definitely think it would be risky to unban, right? I've been considering some sideboard cards against decks like Valakut that do help catch you up when you are behind on lands, for example, and Land Tax is just so much better than alternatives we've got. So maybe we are supposed to put it on keep ban because, if we're using that logic with Mystical Tutor and Reanimate that, these are significantly better than existing options we've got. Land Tax is a lot better. But having said that, we don't really have many similar cards to it, so maybe that's not the best way to judge it, if that makes sense. But yeah, I do think this one would be risky to unban, but I don't think it would really be format warping. This is an interesting one, though, because again, I think out of all the cards on this list, this is the one that I have the least clue on. So in the comments, if you have played with this card or, if it did get unbanned, where do you think it would see play? What sort of effect do you think it would have on the format? Because for me, I think out of all of them, this is the hardest one to visualize where it would fit and what it would do to the format. But I think, for me, I don't think it's quite on the same level as these cards, but I don't advocate for unbanning. I think there would definitely be a lot of risk to unbanning it here. The next up, we've got Intruder Alarm, which honestly for me is one of the most baffling pre-bans I think I've ever seen. This one for me is, why is this banned? I mean, I understand why it's banned, but I think it could be perfectly safe and actually be an interesting addition to the format. So obviously the issue with Intruder Alarm is it does go infinite with a lot of different stuff, but it's 3 mana cards. There aren't, as far as I'm aware, any cheaper cards that you could cast on turn 1 or 2 into Intruder Alarm on turn 3 and then go off. let me know if I'm wrong. If there is something like that, then it would probably be between these two, really. But if in Historic, which I think is the case, you would have to go turn 3 or turn 2 if you can accelerate into it, Intruder Alarm, into a way to go infinite with it, then I think it's perfectly safe and actually be a completely fine, probably fringe deck in the format. Because if we have a look at combo decks in Historic right now, you got stuff like Val Trellisara, which again, it's a 2.5 card combo, and creatures are obviously more vulnerable to interaction than enchantments are, but 2 mana as opposed to 3 mana is a really big deal. A lot of the stuff that goes infinite with Intruder Alarm is 4 mana, a lot of it needs haste to work, and also, one of the big benefits of having your combo be creature based is it's way easier to tutor those with Green Sun Zenith and Chord of Calling and stuff. So it seems like you would have to go through so much more work for Intruder Alarm to actually work. Not to mention that it's much more difficult to find. There isn't really much redundancy for this sort of effect as well. So I think Intruder Alarm would be completely fine and would probably be very interesting for fringe decks. I don't even think it would be particularly good, to be honest. So this is one of the ones alongside Spreading Seas that kind of just baffled me when it was pre-banned, even back then, which was years ago at this point. So yeah, I think this one will be completely safe unbanned. Again, if there is something that enables you to go 1 or 2 mana creature into Intruder Alarm and immediately go off, then maybe we could have arguments about it being too strong, but I can't really find anything that does that. So let me know in the comments if you can think of anything like that, or let me know in the comments what you think would be the best build of an Intruder Alarm if it was legal in Historic, and whether you think that would be problematic, because everything I've looked at so far that goes infinite with an Intruder Alarm doesn't seem to me any better or any easier to set up than Val combo, for example. The next up, we've got Gut True Soul Zealot, which, again, similar to Lantax, a card I've not really played with or against that much. I have seen it a couple of times on the other side of the board, playing Timeless against the Mono Red Prison deck, but compared to Broadside Bombardiers, it really doesn't seem as good. Now, again, it was very recently pre-banned, and I can see why it would be too efficient on rate, but again, I think I'm going to put it into risky to unban, and I think while we're on the topic, Broadside Bombardiers does seem too strong for Historic, in my opinion. It feels like a little bit too above rate. Now, obviously, we don't have Ancient Tomb to accelerate into it, but, we've already got great acceleration. You could easily run a Gruul deck and consistently cast this on turn 2. And the extra reach it provides, the extra damage it provides, the fact it has haste as opposed to Gut makes me think that it's more in the keep banned category. But again, similar to Natural Order, I imagine this one will be slightly more near the top than some of the other stuff. But yeah, again, I haven't played with or against these cards too much, but considering this was a pretty recent pre-ban and these cards do both see play in Timeless, I am, with these two, kind of more happy to defer that Wizards have made the right choice. If this was an older pre-ban and I had played against them, then I'd have probably more of a valid opinion. So with these two cards, definitely let me know what you think. I mean, again, I imagine most people would think Bombardiers is too powerful for Historic, but Gut True Soul Zealot is closer. So definitely let me know in the comments what you think about this one. Grief, I mean, I think I'm going to put this one into no chance. I mean, maybe we're supposed to just put all the pitch elementals into keep banned, but Grief does seem like the biggest issue. The fact it can be used proactively and reactively is really strong. The fact it sees play as a 4 of in a ton of combo decks in order to protect the combo is a bit of a red flag for me. So I think out of all of them, Grief is probably the closest to move into no chance, but I don't think, again, I don't think Grief is quite on the same level as your Mana Drains and your Strip Mines and stuff, so I think I'm going to put it in keep banned. But honestly, out of all of them, I think Grief would be the biggest issue, followed by Fury, followed by Solitude, followed by Subtlety, followed by Endurance, if I had to rank them. Force of Vigor, again, I'm not going to advocate for unbanning because it is a free spell, and I would prefer to keep free spells out of Historic, but I think we've got to put it in risky to unban. The least of the unbanned categories, if that makes sense, right? We've already got similar effects in terms of enchantment and artifact removal. I don't think this would really be too much. So out of all the free spells, I think this would be the one that I would be okay with the most. But again, I want them to be consistent, and I'm happy for them to keep free spells out of Historic as well. So I don't think I can put it any higher or lower than risky to unban, really. Force of Negation, again, keep it in the keep bans category. Probably more powerful than Flare of Denial because it's much easier to build around. You don't need a creature in play, which means you can effectively use it on turn 0 if you wanted to. But again, I'm happy to keep 3 spells out, and Force of Negation is arguably one of the best ones of all time. So next up we got Field of the Dead, and I'm pretty torn on this one because I know from having played in formats where Field of the Dead is legal that it does have a pretty format warping effect when it does see play. It really punishes slower decks, especially Control and mid-range to a lesser extent as well. And I do like Control being a part of the format. Now, having said that, Draw Go, conventional style Control hasn't really been a big part of the historic landscape for such a long time now, and Field of the Dead would be like the final nail in the coffin for that. The thing I'm thinking, though, is whether it would actually see much play if it was legal. And again, I'm sure it would because we've had so many additional tools, Exploration, Burgeoning. We've seen from the Valakut list that we have a ton of tools to get lands like Field of the Dead online. My main thought process in terms of an argument for it being legal is it worse than Valakut right now? Because being able to actually win the game rather than relying on producing a bunch of tokens to attack is a pretty big difference. But having said that, I think Field of the Dead is probably slightly easier to enable than Valakut because we don't have fetch lands to have a bunch of mountains in play, so maybe Field of the Dead would come online a little bit earlier than Valakut would be, so, you're getting your tokens in play a turn sooner than Valakut would start pinging the opponent anyway. But regardless, in terms of just the long-term health of the format, I don't think having Field of the Dead legal is healthy, really, because if it doesn't see play, then it's not really adding anything, and if it does see play, it's just pushing slower decks out of the format, which I don't really like in general. So again, I'm not going to put it in keep banned because I do think there's a debate to be had here about whether Field of the Dead could coexist, harmoniously in historic at the moment and going forwards. But I think if it does get to a point where Field of the Dead is good, it is having a negative impact on the format overall. Not to mention, we just don't. Again, one of the biggest issues with historic right now is that some lands are really powerful and really difficult to interact with, and the same sort of thing would apply to Field of the Dead. So I don't really advocate it being unbanned just for the health of the format long term, I think. The next up we got Entomb. Again, I think we have to put this in the keep ban strategy for the same sort of reason as, Mystical Tutor and Reanimate. It is just so much more efficient than anything else that we've got in Historic right now. It just seems like a bit of a power level outlier for me. So same sort of logic as these two cards, really. And again, to be honest, outside of Buried Alive, we don't really have a similar alternative, and this is 3 times cheaper than it. Not to mention, we already have good 2-mana reanimation spells in Persist and Life Death, so can you imagine the amount of games where you go turn 1 Entomb, Atraxa, turn 2 Life, and then you barely need to invest in reanimation targets. You don't really need to run looting effects either. It would just push the deck way too high, I think. Dark Ritual, no chance. I mean, this is one that I've been saying is borderline too good for Timeless, and if it's too good for Timeless and it's so format warping there, no chance in Historic. I don't think anyone's advocating for a Dark Ritual unban in Historic. Brainstorm, I mean, you could argue to put it in a similar category to Preordain, but I actually think Brainstorm is probably better than Preordain right now because, when it was legal, even without fetch lands, it was way too good, and now we do see Prismatic Vista, and, it immediately puts those 3 cards in your hand. I do feel like it's just a step above that. Not to mention it also has a bunch of other synergies, like it immediately flipping Tameo, which is one of the most played 1-drops in the format already. So yeah, Brainstorm, again, absolutely keep banned, and I think it is a step above Preordain. Dark Depths, again, I think this would be massively format warping. We don't really have great ways to interact with it. I think one of the big reasons why Dark Depths isn't as good in Timeless is because of Strip Mine. Without Strip Mine, we have Crop Rotation, we have Vampire Hexmage, we have all of the tools outside of Once Upon a Time that the Timeless builds have. I mean, maybe Timeless having fetch lands is nice, but even then, if you're running the Turbo Depths builds, you don't really have that much room for fetch lands anyway. So yeah, I think Dark Depths, having played with this in Timeless, I feel like if you played it in Historic, we have almost all of the same tools, but just way less counterplay. You also don't have Solitude to exile the token. You don't have Swords to Plowshares to exile the token either. So yeah, I mean, Dark Depths for me belongs, like, if you just think about what the Depths list would look like in Historic and the current counterplay we have to it, it just feels to me like if this was legal, it would be immediately the best tier 1 deck for me. Commandeer is kind of interesting. Again, it's a free spell, so I'm not going to advocate for it being unbanned because I want to keep the same philosophy, but this is one of the safer ones, I think. It's such a big cost having to exile 2 blue cards compared to something like a Subtlety or, a Force of Negation, for example. And the only real synergies that you have with this is with stuff like Up the Beanstalk, which, we do have... Violent Outburst into Up the Beanstalk, so we do have the remnants of the old Beanstalk decks in Modern, but that whole deck was built around the Evoke Elementals. I don't think we really have enough cards for this to be viable. So again, don't advocate for this being unbanned because I do want to keep free spells out of Historic, but out of the free spells, I think this would likely be the safest one alongside Force of Vigor. Chromox, no chance. Again, fast mana, we want out of the format, and this is just so easy to enable. Unlike Mox Opal, this does just go into basically every deck you want it to. And yeah, again, fast mana we want to keep out of the format for sure. Same sort of thing, Channel. This is one of the only restricted cards in Timeless, so I don't really need to say much about Channel. It's arguably one of the best cards on Arena, so definitely not. Same sort of thing with Ancient Tomb, right? If I'm complaining about Eldrazi Temple, got to keep Ancient Tomb unbanned as well. And then finally, Agent of Treachery. Again, why is this one banned? I know originally why it was banned, but Historic has moved way past the time when Agent of Treachery was banned. And honestly, there's been multiple decks where I've wanted to run Agent of Treachery in Reanimator Persist. Creativity Persist Reanimator hybrid decks. Because if you look at the existing options that we've got for Persist or Indomitable Creativity or Life Death, for example, which is the main place I think Agent of Treachery would see play if it did see play. The current options we've got, you got stuff like Ashen Rider, Summon Bahamut. And I think the issue with Agent of Treachery in those sorts of decks, because I have played this in similar decks in the past, is that it's just a one-shot effect on a pretty small body. So yes, you can go Faithless Looting, ditch Agent of Treachery turn 1, bring it back from the graveyard with Persist turn 2, steal your opponent's land, which is a powerful play, especially in terms of tempo. But if your whole deck is built around doing that and you don't have much of a follow-up, all you've got in play is more lands than your opponent in a 2-3, right? The big difference compared to a card like Ashen Rider is Ashen Rider is a 5-5 with flying. So you immediately put the opponent on a 4-turn clock and they're behind on lands. When you've only got a 2-3, that's really not as big of a deal. And if you compare it to a card like Archon of Cruelty, which does somewhat of a similar thing, but obviously doesn't take their land, the reason why Archon is so broken is because it has a big impact when it comes down, it has flying, it has high power, so it presents a fast clock, and it then starts triggering each turn as well. So I don't even know if Agent of Treachery sees play in the one deck it would see play in over alternatives like Ashen Rider, because it doesn't really present a fast enough clock, meaning it gives the opponent a good way to get back in the game if you then don't have a good follow-up play, if that makes sense. So those are all the cards. Next up, I'm going to try and rank them within the ranks. So top left in each category is going to be safest to unban, and then as we go further to the right, then it becomes, more risky. So in terms of these cards in the why is this banned, I definitely think Agent of Treachery is the one that's most likely to see play alongside Intruder Alarm, because again, there is some combo potential there. So there could be some decks built around this that see play. Then I think the Time Warp cards are the safest out of this entire category, because there isn't really too much broken stuff you can do with it. Like I said, you could do the Velomachus stuff if you want. That's nowhere near good enough anymore, in my opinion. You could do the Eternal Witness Blink with Ephemerate, but again, that's slow. I've tried stuff like that with Orim's Chant, which is way cheaper and does a very similar thing, and the shell itself already feels too slow, let alone replacing a 1 or 2 mana card in Orim's Chant with a 5 mana card. Now, having said that, taking infinite turns is significantly better than locking the opponent out, but the issue with those decks is they take such a big mana investment to get going in the first place that putting in 5 mana sorceries is just way too slow. And then Spreading Seas, I think it would likely see more play, but in terms of being a bannable card, I think it's less egregious than a Nexus of Fate, for example. So I'm pretty happy with this ordering for the top one. Then probably safe, Lightning Bolt has to go there. Lightning Bolt is definitely a safer unban than Wilderness Reclamation, in my opinion, and that's that category sorted. Risky to unban. This is where things get a little bit more complicated for me. So first of all, I think I'm going to put Force of Vigor and Endurance. Again, I don't want free spells added to historic, but these are, if they were going to allow some based on power level, I think these two would actually be completely fine in terms of power level in historic. Then if we're looking at the rest of them, I mean, Memory Lapse also has to go up here. Again, this one might be more personal preference. Power level wise, I think it's probably fine, but it is just kind of miserable to play against, so I think we'll put that there. Then, actually, wait, Commandeer should be up here as well, because Commandeer, again, these are the 3 free spells that I think are historic power level, even though I don't really want them in the format. Then out of the rest, I think Preordain has to go a little bit higher, because there's a caveat here that if Ponder wasn't legal, I think Preordain would be completely fine to be had in the format. It does a very, very similar thing. Pyrokinesis, again, it's a free spell, but again, I don't think it's really too much of an issue. So again, I think I'm going to put this up here with the other free spells. The flares are more of an issue. You know, I think the flare of Solitude, or the protective one, is less of an issue than Flare of Duplication. I feel like Flare of Duplication, the issue you would have with this card is, if it's not seeing play, what's the point of unbanning it? And if it is seeing play in a good deck, then it's going to be too pushed. So I think I want this one, relatively low. You know, Seething Song is much less of an issue than the flares, I think, or Flare of Duplication at the very least. And then Land Tax, again, I'm not really sure on this one, so I think I'm going to put it there. Mishra's Bauble, I mean, it would definitely be a buff to certain archetypes. And again, if you're happy with banning Lurrus, which, if we're being honest, will probably happen eventually in Historic anyway, as more cheap good cards get added. So I think we can put Bauble there. Gut, again, I'm not 100% sure on, but I think Seething Song is probably... I mean, it's tricky to see because it really depends what the best Seething Song deck is. Whether that is just accelerating into a Cavern Consumed, or people can figure out like a really good Storm deck with Underworld Breach. I think if a Breach deck is viable and the best deck, then Seething Song is more of an issue there, because then it will be like the main enabler in the deck. So I think we put Gut there, Uro ahead of Seething Song, and then Field of the Dead. Again, I just don't think it's good for the long-term health of the format. So I think I'm pretty happy with the ordering here. This category is going to get a bit messy. This one might take a little bit more time. So first of all, I think I'm going to put Winter Moon, I don't know about right near the bottom, because we have got a lot of really broken cards in here. So I think we'll just put stuff nearer the top that I don't think is as much of an issue. So looking here, we've got the Evoke Elementals, Frantic Search. Okay, yeah, Natural Order, I don't think is as bad here, if I'm being perfectly honest. Like, again, it probably would be too pushed, but I'd be interested to see what the format would look like. And I can see a format where Natural Order is legal and the format is okay, because there is obviously counterplay to it. It is a 4-mana sorcery. Discard spells, counter spells will naturally be a good counterplay to it. Veil of Summer, again, I don't personally like the effect it has on the format, but again, it's not as pushed as some of these cards. Fire Blast, I'm probably going to put relatively near the top as well. Subtlety I don't hate as an Evoke Elemental. I mean, Trickery I'm putting at the bottom just because I hate the card. I think it has such a bad impact on the format in terms of gameplay. Sneak Attack, I mean, yeah, Sneak Attack I wasn't sure about initially, but the comparison to Cavern Consumed when it's already seeing play wants me to have it quite high. So I think we move Mystical Tutor up here, probably move Reanimate down a bit. I think Entomb probably has to go lower than Reanimate in terms of, I think it's more risky to unban because we just don't have any other comparisons to it, whereas we do already have Persistent Life Death compared to Reanimate. Brainstorm, I think we can move up a little bit as well. Bombardiers, I feel like we should probably put above Oko. And then, yeah, I think we want to put the free counter spells near the bottom as well. And I'll put them near Grief. So yeah, I think I'm pretty happy with the ordering here as well. And then finally for No Chance, I mean, it doesn't really matter about these cards because they're all just absolutely broken, I think. So I'm not going to bother reordering them. But that's the tier list overall. Again, there's a ton of discussion to be had here, I think. So if you disagree with these, or if you think there's something that I've just missed with these cards, you know, if there's a card up here that you think I've missed an interaction with that would be format warping for Historic, let me know. If you think I've overstated how, you know, busted any of these cards would be, let me know. And also, I was thinking, you know, if this if you like this sort of video, another one that I was tempted to do was have a look at all the cards that have so far been nerfed in Historic. And first of all, whether I think the nerf is good and whether I think another nerf would have been appropriate. And second of all, whether I think the nerf could be undone now. You know, like one of the most obvious ones that comes to mind is Cauldron Familiar. Like that card has no business being nerfed anymore, I don't think. Whereas something like Goblin Trap Finder or Crucius even, which still sees play in nerfed form, you know, I think there's an interesting debate to be had there as well. So definitely let me know in the comments if you want to see that going forwards. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video though, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.